Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've had a wonderful time so far. I want to take this opportunity before I introduce myself to thank Base 11 for inviting me and allowing me to be a part of such an incredible event. I know that when I was starting my path, or my career path rather, that we will discuss at length, I would have really appreciated attending something like this to give me a little bit of sense of direction. With that being said, my name is Debbie Rumbo. I am a strategy consultant that operates her own consulting practice, but also new budding investor in venture capital. I would like to start our conversation as I traditionally start everything else, which is by setting an intention. I just want to intend to be of service, and I hope that anything or something that I say, I hope resonates with you and allows you to kind of move forward in the best way that you seem fit. I always also like to say that take what you like and leave the rest. Some of the things will resonate more than others, and I just hope that anything that comes out of my mouth today and in terms of our conversation can be lucrative to, or at least guide you in a direction that you're eventually seeking to pursue. So with that being said, our conversation today, really, I want to focus on how our perceived weaknesses can actually be our strengths. And you'll see why I kind of have that theme throughout this talk on career. As far as I'm aware, all of us in this room have at one point or another experienced a feeling of isolation or confusion or a sense of like imposter syndrome. And that can sometimes be hard to navigate, especially when you're the first person in your family oftentimes, or when you're kind of going into a space that nobody else that you know has kind of ventured into. I think that to that effect, and you will see my cat who is lurking in the corner, to that effect, I kind of want to break down the chat to essentially where I come from, who am I, going into kind of early career, what that looked like for me, how I made the transition into venture capital, then breaking a little bit into what venture capital is, a little bit of like maybe the terminology that people kind of move around in the industry, because that could be interesting and difficult to navigate, especially if you are kind of looking into it for your first time or even just kind of getting introduced to the industry. And then I'd like to end our conversation today with, some takeaways, some tips, tricks, and guides that have been very helpful for me to not even just situate myself mentally, but also position myself professionally. So with that being said, I grew up in Fullerton, California. For those of you that don't know where Fullerton is located in Orange County, which can be a very conservative or traditionally conservative area in California. And it's by Fullerton neighbors Anaheim, which is where Disneyland is based, like the original Disneyland. My mom is Mexican. My dad is Nigerian. My first language is Spanish. So in that mouthful, I have said a lot of things that basically position my story to be one that is non-traditional. Since my first language is Spanish, and obviously I am mixed, it was difficult to navigate kind of being mixed race and first generation. Sorry, my cat is going insane. Being first generation in college, but also kind of pioneering a lot of firsts for my family. I was fortunate enough to get a full ride to go to USC. And that obviously like changed in a lot of ways the trajectory of my life. Up until that happened, I hustled really hard in high school because I had a conversation with my mom, who came to the States when she was 14. She was the first person in her family to do so. My dad had a similar trajectory, but kind of came from more of like an established, you're going to go to school type situation. My mom was not like that. She, like I said, came here when she was 14, got a fake ID to basically work in the factories of Los Angeles, and added 2 years to her life, 16, so she could work. And for her, always valued education, but really never got beyond maybe like junior high 7th grade level. So for me growing up, education was obviously a pillar, but also we didn't have a lot of money. So she was very quick to tell me that essentially, if I didn't get a full ride or if I didn't get a scholarship, I wasn't going to go to college. So with that came a lot of pressure in terms of like, how do I get financed and is college for me type of thing. Luckily, it turned out that, I did my AP classes. I did everything under the sun, was in dance, was in volleyball, was leading team, or not teams, but clubs. And that led me to getting a full ride to USC, which in itself was a culture shock because USC traditionally has a lot of people with a lot of wealth and high net worth. And I met a lot of incredible friends that basically came from opposite backgrounds to me. I, through USC, was able to kind of travel the world, do a lot of international research experience and exposure, which again kind of pitted me differently from the path that my family had traditionally taken. I come from a family of farmers and entrepreneurs, and that also feeds into my narrative later on down the line. But essentially, got an opportunity to do all that as I was navigating college. I thought I was going to be a human rights attorney, an international human rights attorney. So again, all of my travels kind of fomented that spirit in me. It took a couple internships abroad and here to recognize that the attorney life was not for me. I wanted something a little bit more flexible where I could go into an office but didn't have to be tied down to a desk. I'm very much more social in my spirit and in my nature. And that kind of set me off into like, okay, after I graduated, realized that, maybe the attorney life was not for me, even though I had taken the LSAT and did very well on that, decided to kind of pursue a different path. And I ended up working in a finance firm as an assistant. First exposure ever to finance. Funny enough, I thought that the finance firm that I was working with, Guggenheim Partners, was actually a museum. Because I've always been creative also. So I thought I went into the interview thinking that I was going to be working for the museum, and it ended up being an investment advisory firm that had like billions of dollars in assets under management. Did not know what the freak that meant at all at the time. And I was like the only like Black Latina woman in the firm, I would say. But it taught me a lot about the industry and a lot about the players in the game. Also very much felt like a fish out of water the entire time. People were talking about like investment banking and municipal bonds and all this other stuff that I was like, what the freak? What is going on? But navigated that well, made a lot of friends there, and it essentially like realized that finance was a conduit to creating access and equity for communities of color. If we were to have access to those kind of networks, which, traditionally we don't. Also got exposed to a lot of wealth, which before I was very intimidated by because, up until that moment, I grew up very on the other end of the spectrum to that. USC was kind of like the intermediary in terms of like, oh, people actually live like this and not everybody struggles. I worked throughout college and all that jazz, and obviously I had friends that didn't. But all in all, I realized that, finance was an avenue to all the things that I kind of wanted to see in my community and even for myself. So I worked there for a couple of years. I was, I helped, like I said, investment bankers and managers, specifically got close to the equity desk, the private equity desk. And I had a really incredible mentor by the name of Jason Flowers there that like really just like took me under his wing, gave me things to read. At that moment in time, I was still like trying to like fit myself and not paying attention to what my inner self was telling me already, that I did not want to be an attorney, but I had already taken the LSAT. I did very well. I got into school, all that jazz. And I was really trying to mitigate like, it doesn't make sense after all the work that I did to not end up going to school. But that ended up happening. I decided not to go to law school, which was a huge like shift in direction. And as I was working at Guggenheim, I had also started doing kind of side consulting projects, or at that moment in time, I didn't know that it was called consulting. I thought I was just doing like side hustles, to kind of allow my brain to operate in a different capacity, because I've always been super entrepreneurial myself by trade and by family, but also just I've always been creative, and I like to bridge both of these things together, left brain and right brain. So I was taking on clients at the time that were basically BIPOC entrepreneurs that often just either knew Spanish or didn't know how to navigate the landscape of like marketing, especially with the changing tides. I just came in willing to help and provide strategy and methods for creating strategic partnerships and scaling businesses. Learned a lot through that process, but I eventually came to the realization that like working in a finance firm, I wanted to do more, and I want to do more in terms of impact. So I was like, maybe I need to go into philanthropy, because again, in my mind, I was like going to be an international human rights attorney, and essentially that was going to lead, to change and dynamics, all the things that I know that kind of fuel us now as the next new young generation of professionals. So essentially, I went to work for philanthropy, and I was working for a nonprofit that basically provided pro bono reconstructive surgery to people, women, men, children that had experienced heinous crimes against their body and against, their livelihoods, all the things that kind of violated human rights, which again went in tune with what I want to do in terms of being an attorney, but also kind of trying to figure out what other pathways there was to that. From there, I learned how to not only lead teams, but also learn how to fundraise, learn how to operationalize processes, and essentially was just fomenting, like learning how to scale businesses that created impact and were mission driven. Needless to say, philanthropy was wonderful, but also did not pay. I found myself essentially paying myself to work from the wonderful bonuses I had received in finance, and kind of supplementing my income in the nonprofit with my bonuses, which obviously in a long-term scenario didn't work. I decided to leave the nonprofit space and really go back into finance, but now with the objective of finance also gearing towards impact. That led me to the private equity social impact firm that I was working with for about 3.5 years. And their focus was basically in 3 funds: healthcare, housing, and education for the disappearing middle class. Obviously, a lot of like Black, Latino clients, I would say, that we had in all of those spaces. And the idea was to democratize information, but also provide infrastructure and programs around things that people that come from low income needed. And for me, that was especially important because I kind of found an avenue to bridge impact and finance together. There I started essentially as the executive assistant to the CEO, and then moved to, becoming an operator for the office, but also just our processes and our procedures. Kind of led and started the corporate social responsibility wing and arm of that firm, and really grew as a leader, analyst, strategist, marketer, pretty much everything under the sun, because I was kind of like a catch-all role. Really grateful to that company for essentially like springboarding me into understanding that after a certain amount of time, I had to go out on my own. It was a scary decision because, again, I basically have built myself up ever since I've known what that entailed. And like I said, back in my first job, I had already kind of started building clients and that kind of basis for essentially creating a consulting company, but I didn't know that it was called consulting until like later on in my life. The pandemic was a really pivotal moment for me because I started to realize that I was fundamentally dissatisfied with the trajectory I had taken on. I had kind of allowed myself to shush my inner thoughts and feelings that had already told me, like, maybe you need to go out on your own. Maybe you need to start your own business. Maybe you can do more than what you're doing now. And although I loved everybody that I worked with, I fundamentally felt like I had betrayed myself in my inner knowing by not going for it. There was so much fear in my heart and in my spirit, because I didn't want to fail, and I didn't want to disappoint my family, who I think to a certain extent has always seen me as a person that like knows what they're doing. And I guess here's the first disclaimer, and kind of skipping over to the takeaways. Like, it's okay to not know what you're doing sometimes, and it's okay to kind of navigate blindly. The most important aspect is for you to remain true to who you are and what you know you want to do. And even though that may oftentimes be the road less traveled, it's always the road that is the most worth it. So going out on my own during the pandemic, I set an intention for myself to basically one day be able to say that I was able to bet on myself and see the benefits to that. I also wanted my story to one day give somebody hope, just in case, or in the moment, or in the space of, I did it and no one else before me in my family, or even in my immediate network at the time, did it that I knew. And here I am still doing it, and now having grown so much from the experience. So with that, my consulting practice took off during the pandemic, which was like weird, because everybody was getting fired during the pandemic or deciding to quit, because I think everybody came to this realization of like, what do I like to do? What do I want to do? And how do I actually do it? And then there's few people that actually went out and did it. And I think I was among those few that many people perceive to be a little bit unhinged and crazy for doing that. But retrospectively, hindsight is always 2020. I would do it again multiple times over, because it really taught me that everything that I had inside of myself, every single experience, every single rejection, every single time I had to navigate learning a new environment, learning a new language, speaking to people that intimidated me, pitching myself, pitching my business, everything that we do on an everyday basis to make people like us or make people see us was so important to where I was going to go, even though at that time I didn't understand. So that leads me to started a consulting practice, particularly focused on, again, scaling businesses, creating strategies, go-to-market strategies, operationalizing processes, project management, marketing, especially for people of color and women and founders that needed help to navigate that landscape. So I did that, and the most difficult thing I've ever done, still to this day, I would say the most difficult thing I've ever done, including going into venture capital, which in itself is scary and difficult. But because of that, I was able to kind of understand myself as a leader and understand that, me knowing Spanish and having a Nigerian dad and a Mexican mother, and like all of my lived experiences of feeling kind of like a fish out of water, the literal black sheep of my family, and navigating all of the firsts was also going to be the thing that kind of put me over the edge as a consultant, right? Because I understood culturally who my clients were and what their needs were, and how they want to kind of put their narratives out there into the world, and why those narratives are important to even see. One of the reasons why I'm doing this is because, again, there's not a lot of us out here in venture, or even as entrepreneurs of color, women of color that have done this before, because I think we have been traditionally conditioned to think small, and it's safer in many ways. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily, at least in my experience, the thing that has made me the happiest. I think I've been the happiest when I've been able to step out and navigate the fear of failing, and the reality of failing, but also the incredible, beautiful, blissful, successful moments where I have seen how betting on myself has actually helped me get further and faster to where I want to go. So in scaling my consulting practice, I started to think about what's next? What more can I do? A lot of my clients, a lot of their issues was not only building and scaling, but also money. It came down to money. How do I get more money? How do I create something that will eventually lead me to a place where, my family doesn't have to struggle, or I'm actually creating wealth? That led me to, what are the avenues to creating wealth? How do I facilitate that for my clients as a strategist, but also like on the other side? A lot of my clients couldn't get loans because the banks wouldn't back them, And so I started to think about like, okay, what does that mean? And what does that avenue look like? So enter venture capital. I learned about venture capital literally in passing and kind of by mistake by a really incredible, wonderful friend that I have that is also in the industry. And he introduced me to Pledge LA, which is a program set forth by the city of LA, Mayor Eric Garcetti, and the Annenberg Foundation. Any of you who want to know more about that, happy to speak more at length about that. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll give you that information, or I think you'll have access to it. So Pledge LA was basically established to facilitate the entry of aspiring venture capitalists or venture operators into the space. The reason why it's so hard is because venture has traditionally been esoteric and limited to people that have money to finance these ventures, which I'll get into. And so Pledge LA has a program that essentially scouts and trains, aspiring venture capitalists to kind of understand the industry, and also places you at venture firms where you can get experience and exposure, so that when you go into the space, you actually have knowledge and wisdom, and it makes it easier in some respects to build your network and to get hired, because traditionally venture, even when you have a particular kind of background, is still very hard because it's a competitive and a cool industry to be in, because everybody wants to fund the next generation unicorn, which is essentially a company that just essentially blows up and changes the trajectory of how we live our life. So an example of that, as most of you guys, I'm sure know, Snapchat, Uber, Facebook, Instagram, all of those things, Apple. So I was selected as a fellow, an investment associate fellow for a syndicate called Cap Table Coalition, where I started my career in venture. Essentially, it is a syndicate of Black and Latino investors, Black, Latino predominantly, but more investors, diverse investors that are basically putting diverse dollars to work by investing in high growth opportunity deals. Because the team was so small, and technically, traditionally, venture teams are small. They're lean because they want to keep, a close eye on the budget that they have to essentially deploy to these startups and early stage companies. And I'll talk more about that. But I got selected as their investment associate, and I was leveraging basically my consulting background, strategy development, business development, marketing, pretty much everything under the sun that I brought to the table. And now incorporating like the investment components that I learned in terms of like how to, run a pipeline process, how to do due diligence. All of these are things that essentially before a company gets funded, they have to be assessed, and they get assessed through certain criteria, right? So you get assessed on teams, you get on your team, you get assessed on your ability to kind of take control of the market or how you're doing in the market, called traction. You get assessed by, the amount of revenue that you're bringing in, your target market and your audience and your client, your product, is it product market fit, and all these different things. And then eventually you get told yes or no. Predominantly venture capitalists say no a lot because venture is by its very nature a very risky industry. So obviously investors are trying to protect their money and their investments, and they want to invest in like the best deals according to their theses, or essentially in a nutshell is like their strategy for picking and selecting companies. And I was able to run their entire deal flow process end to end. So meeting founders and then essentially allocating capital to those founders. Taught me a lot about essentially where I want to be and who I want to work with going forward. But the industry in itself, like I said, is very difficult and hard to navigate by many means. First, being diverse in this space is definitely an asset. So again, it's about leveraging my lived experiences, my professional experience, but also coming in unabashed about like what I know to be true about the people that I serve and the people that I have served, and the things that I'm noticing in the world that people are moving towards. Because essentially venture capitalists are operating on this idea of being keen observers and keen strategists to essentially invest in deals. But that also means that the space is convoluted with different strategies and different walks of life, which makes it a wonderful industry to be in because you're consistently learning, but also makes it so that there are particular pedigrees that are preferred just because of their track record and proven ability to succeed and execute at a high level. That means that, for pioneers in space, Black, Latino, Asian women and men, it's hard. It's hard to break into an industry that has been traditionally white and traditionally reserved for people that have like money to burn, essentially. Obviously nobody wants to burn money, but what I'm saying is like, I don't have family members that just have $1 million to loan me or to give me to invest in a company. And if it gets lost, which is traditionally what happens, a lot of venture capitalists invest money, and if they make like 20 investments, maybe 2 of them become some that, or hopefully more, but let's say out of the 10, maybe 2, 3 of them become companies that actually bring in high returns. But because these companies bring in returns that are significant, it kind of makes up for the other investments that people try to, or that investors or VCs have put out into the market. So with that being said, I think it's good now to kind of go over just like overarching idea of like what venture capital is. I to this day still like am navigating a lot of terminology. So again, I think it's important to ask a lot of questions and to be resilient and to not give up because you don't understand something. I've definitely had to learn that a lot because I think that in the imposter syndrome that I was talking about earlier, a lot of the times we stop ourselves from pursuing what we actually want to do because we have this fear of being perceived as like inadequate or not enough. And a lot of the times it holds us back. Predominantly when I'm saying us, it's like people that are new to the space or people that, again, come from non-traditional backgrounds, because we immediately feel like, well, I don't belong here, and everybody knows that I don't belong here. So I think that having some compassion for yourself and understanding like, okay, I may not know this, but I know this other thing is important to mitigate. At least for me, that has really helped me kind of continue forward and continue to be inquisitive and curious and fun and nice and just in many ways wide-eyed and bushy-tailed about all the things I have yet to learn, rather than looking at it as like, oh my God, I'm never going to make it in this industry because I don't know this, that, or the other. So essentially, with that being said, venture capital is, in a nutshell, like a type of private equity financing that is provided by VC firms, funds, and some family offices to essentially invest in startups or emerging companies in exchange for equity. That means that venture capitalists fund companies that essentially they believe have the capacity to innovate or to change a specific area or space in a market, in a particular market. That is different from small businesses, because small businesses are more like, they operate as obviously businesses, but they're not necessarily businesses that change the landscape of a market, right? So like a coffee shop is pretty much a coffee shop across the board, unless it incorporates some other new technology maybe that makes it different from other coffee shops, and therefore creates a space where other coffee shops that come after it want to adopt that technology to make their coffee shop better or different. So traditionally, small businesses are not venture-backed businesses, but they can be venture-backed businesses. It just depends on essentially what the goal for the business is. If the goal of the business is to become the source or the one and only thing in a particular space, then that pretty much becomes, I think, a better indicator as to whether it would get venture capital funding or not. With that all being said, again, venture capital is like a new cool industry that has a lot of money and is all about networks. So it's absolutely important for those of us that are new or want to be in this space, that are, again, from non-traditional backgrounds, to operate and match that same level of energetic kind of pull. So not being intimidated by money, not being intimidated by people, not being intimidated by ideas, and not being intimidated by what we perceive to be our barriers or obstructions. So some of the key players in the industry, like just overarchingly, are like limited partners, which are traditionally the people that like bring the money. General partners, which are people that essentially run the funds that also deploy capital or deploy money to these startups or these emerging companies. Then we have like principals who work under the GPs that are on GPs, which is general partners. So principals work under GPs and are essentially on the trajectory of becoming partners in the firm. And then we have like senior investment associates essentially running the investment process end to end, doing kind of like what I described in terms of the syndicate that I was working for, meeting people, bringing in folks into the pipeline, kind of asking them questions and doing the due diligence process of the investment, and then essentially allocating the funds to these particular firms, or these particular startups that get selected. Then we have analysts that do market research. Essentially, these are the people that are like looking at markets and understanding like, well, I see a lot of people investing in sustainability or green tech, or the green space, right? What does that mean? That means there's a trend for people to want to, like, I don't know, buy consciously or involve themselves with brands that are operating sustainably. All of that. So just kind of analyzing where the trends are going, what that means for the strategy that that the firm needs to adopt or the family office needs to adopt, and what that means for the companies that they're going to be looking for and the criteria that is being set. Outside of that, there's like the operating team, because everybody works, all the investors can't do anything without people that help them kind of keep the wheels oiled in like the firm or the family office, or even just like the fund structure as a whole. So obviously we have platform. Platform can take on many forms, but platform essentially is the people that are helping the companies that the firm invests in to grow, to scale, to kind of fill in those gaps that the company kind of comes in. They wouldn't be emerging or they wouldn't be startups if everything was figured out. So platform really takes on the role of like fulfilling marketing needs or kind of giving founders strategy or support in any way or capacity that they need in order to get exposure to other networks or other funding or other sources of revenue and clients. We also have like the lawyers, the people that like basically put all the contracts together, make sure that the equity is divided appropriately, and kind of keep those legal parameters in tune with wherever it is that we're operating. And then there's like obviously HR that does like the talent acquisition and essentially make sure that the venture team has all of the pieces that they need in order to be successful. Because again, traditionally the teams are very lean, and every person on the team has to play an integral role in terms of how it's operating and running. Which also makes, again, for the very naturally competitive industry that venture capital finds itself in. And it's reserved traditionally for people that have money to deploy, but also people that have a sense of knowledge that has not been previously brought to the table, right? So again, this goes back to, as a person myself that like comes from a non-traditional in many ways background, the thing that I have found the most incredible about being in venture is the fact that I can leverage the fact that I've grown up differently, right? I've grown up with a sense of scrappiness and a sense of creating something out of nothing that informs the decisions that I make as a venture capitalist investor, right? But also adds to like what I bring to the table when we talk to founders, right? Especially founders that come from my similar background, or especially founders that kind of emulate a little bit of, or maybe a lot of the clients that I've worked with in the past, which I think can be really great. So with all of that, some key learnings that I've learned and some takeaways that I hope that you take, obviously, away from this conversation is like, learn how to be curious with yourself. And really, like, I know that sounds corny and cheesy, and I'm like in Los Angeles and we're traditionally very like hippie-esque and spiritual, but really and truly like get curious about what you like to do, about who you are, about what makes you tick, about the things that maybe traditionally you have had to kind of shun away from because, the traditional corporate career environment tells you that you have to be a specific way, a particular way in order to be successful. I have found that to be actually kind of the opposite. I love the fact that I'm biracial, that my first language is Spanish, that sometimes I transpose the words that I'm speaking because my first language was not English. I love the fact that, my mom taught me from a very early age to hustle, to grind, to not be complacent with where it is that I'm at, and just to push with resilience. I'm grateful at the fact that, I've had to essentially have a lot of no's and a lot of people that don't understand where I come from. And frankly, have underestimated my ability to be where I'm at because I didn't have a particular pedigree or whatever that they thought I needed in order to succeed. I love that because a part of what fuels me is to be a conduit and an open door for people that have my similar background to tell you that screw that. All of the things that people who don't understand you, who will never understand you, who don't want to understand you, don't see in you are the things, and don't see in you and are inherently in you, but are in disguise in a different way that they don't understand, are your biggest assets. They are the thing that's going to push you forward. They are the thing that's going to make you successful. They are the thing that is going to make you work harder than everybody else. And with that, I think being said also, it's knowing that you already have everything that you need in order to be successful. And the only thing that is holding us back from ourselves is often our ability to really understand that and to change that perspective within ourselves. Because I think that often we are our own biggest critics. We are our own biggest boundaries to whatever it is that we want to do. I can tell you that I literally started as a career assistant that became an entrepreneur, a successful entrepreneur in consulting. And now I'm an investor or a budding investor in a space that is traditionally not reserved for us. And there's power in that. There's empowerment in that. There's struggle, there's hustle, there's tears, there's blood, sweat, and tears. But I think essentially there is a resilience that, by our very nature of being people that have traditionally been underestimated, kind of is our superpower. I would also say that in that space, like, ask yourself questions, reach out for help, invite people into your world, and really be unabashed about, like, this is what I want to do. This is what I still have trouble with. This is what I'm trying to figure out. Even for me now, it's something that I'm learning how to do better, ask better questions, lead myself to the people that can essentially help me understand something that I don't on my own. Don't hide, go seek. I found myself hiding a lot in the early stages of my career, because I was trying to mold and shift myself into a box that I inherently was just not even made for. And that made me hurt my self-confidence. So when I realized that it's important for us as a whole, especially because you're here and you're here because you want to learn and you want to understand, and you're probably thinking about different ways of expanding, don't hide. Acknowledge what it is that you are feeling, acknowledge what it is that you want to learn, acknowledge what it is that you don't know in an authentic way, so that people that are for you and here with that same energy can match you and find you and help you to get to your next space. So that I count myself as one of those people. Please reach out again. And I think my last takeaway would be, this is something that I came up with after like years of kind of even asking myself these questions. And probably my biggest takeaway for today is, like, I think that oftentimes ideas birthed in our heart are often killed in our head. So it's important to not let your head kill your heart, because your heart is the very thing that will give you that resilience, that will give you that courage to step into spaces where you may be the only one in the room to think the way that you do. And you may be the only one that can really change the narrative and the perspective that other people that have been in that room no longer see, because they're detached from that essence of creation and innovation. Sometimes our youth is our strength. Sometimes our lived experience is our strength. And oftentimes, our lived experience, our youth, all the things that make us us, are stored in our heart and are driving us towards what we actually want. But our head begins to rationalize and tell us, like, well, this is not going to work because you don't have this, that, or the other. So I want to thank you guys all so much for just being brave enough to even come into this conversation and looking into venture. Again, I full and wholeheartedly offer myself as a resource. So please reach out to me on LinkedIn if you have any questions. We can go further. And with that, I will leave you to the next presenters, which I'm sure have incredible things to also share with you guys. Jason Ortiz and Christina Goldschmidt. So thank you guys all so much. It was a pleasure, and I hope you have a wonderful day.